I think everyone can see the slides.
Yes, sir, they have confirmed.
Thank you.
So hello everyone, I'm Manali Karmakar. On behalf of VIT Chennai, Division of Social Sciences and Languages, I and Dr. Binu Sahayam welcome all of you to this web event on medical humanities. Thanks a lot. And Binu, it's a special thanks to you for helping me to organize this session. I hope I'm audible to all of you. I hope I'm audible to everyone here.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a moment of privilege for me to introduce Professor Stuart Murray, the director of the Center for Medical Humanities at the University of Leeds. Professor Murray teaches contemporary literature and film in the School of English at the University of Leeds. He is also the author or editor of 10 books, the most recent being Disability and the Posthuman, Bodies, Technology and Cultural Future, published by Liverpool University Press 2020. His next book is Medical Humanities and Disability Studies, Beyond Disciplines, and will be published by Bloomsbury Academic Press in 2021. He is the principal investigator on a Wellcome Trust Collaborative Research Award entitled Imagining Technologies for Disability Futures that has partners in the UK, the US, and Japan, and will run until 2025. So we are really very fortunate to have you for the session. Without your support, I don't believe we would have been able to organize this event. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you. And over to you, sir.
First, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to Manali for the invitation and for, along with her colleagues, all of the organization. I very much appreciate it. I'm very humbled and proud to be speaking to you this afternoon. And I hope it will be a really useful hour. What we planned in advance was that I would talk for about maybe 35, possibly 40 minutes, because I always believe it's a good idea to allow time for questions at the end. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope that I don't talk too long and that we have adequate time for those questions. If there are any technical problems as we go, Manali, please just do tell me. I'll tell you if I can't hear anything or anything goes wrong. And I'm sure we can always get back to where we need to be. So what I'm going to do is go through a series of slides and speak to them. I'll probably read out most of them because they make my points, I hope, quite well. And my idea is to do a quite wide-ranging introduction to medical humanities, as I understand it to exist and to be practiced, especially across, I think, the global north. One of the reasons I'm excited to give this talk today is I think all of us who work in medical and health humanities in the UK, across Europe, and in the US have always recognized that we need to be more global. We need to attend to the way in which the relationship between medicine, health, and the humanities are practiced in a variety of cultures across the world. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how people understand the subject and what people want to do with the subject in Chennai, in India, and beyond. So my wide-ranging introduction is two things, really. I want it to be fundamentally ideas-based. So what I'm going to be talking about are the ideas that I think have driven medical humanities as it's developed. But because I also want to talk about how it's developed, I'm going to be loosely chronological. In other words, I'm going to try and have a frame around the way I talk about the ideas that kind of moves from around about 20 years ago to the present. I would say, roughly speaking, that's the history, the time of the history of medical humanities as a discipline, that it moves from, say, the late 90s, possibly a bit earlier, to the present. And now it is a vibrant, dynamic field of interdisciplinary study that I think is producing exciting work across a whole variety of subjects, whether they be in the arts or the sciences or in medicine and health. So I hope that all makes sense. And I hope I also go slow enough so that no one feels I'm rushing through the slides. I think I've given myself adequate time. So again, thank you very much, and it's very happy to be here. Oh, if occasionally I don't look at the camera, it's because I have another screen next to me, which is where I've got my slides. So please excuse my odd movement of the head. So I wanted to start with what I think for many people is the kind of originary moment of where the medical humanities begins. And it's what Anne Whitehead and Angela Woods, in the introduction to their excellent book, The Edinburgh Companion to the Medical Humanities, called the primal scene, the foundational moment, if you will. And they say, the imaginary of the medical humanities is, we suggest, structured around the clinical encounter between the doctor and the patient. Investigations of this scene, whether empirical, philosophical, literary, or historical, have placed a humanist emphasis on individual protagonists and the role of narrative, metaphor, and gaps in communication within the dynamics of the clinical encounter. I think they're absolutely right when they were writing in 2016 to be reflecting on that moment, as if you like the moment where medical humanities was felt to be coming into being. That relationship between the clinical expertise of the doctor, the clinical background of the doctor, and the experience, the health experience of the patient. One thing I would want to say quite quickly to clear something up here is that in writing this, Whitehead and Woods are not saying this is the only thing medical humanities should do, does do, or will be doing, but they're tracing their ideas back to this moment where, for many, medical humanities came from. Personally, I still think there is a real role for the humanities in this moment of a clinical encounter, in this primal scene. But as I hope I'll go on to show, it's very much not the only moment that the discipline now speaks to, and not the only moment, I think, that's important. So my next slide. That moment back to about 20 years ago, one of the first books on medical humanities published in 2001. And here is a quotation from the editors of that book, Martin Evans and Alora Finlay, about why study medical humanities. What does it do? What does it add to the kind of knowledge we have in medicine and health? How does it develop the things we want to know? And they write, since medicine is concerned at least with responding to our illnesses, our physical incapacities, and our bodily suffering, then it could not consist of the natural biological sciences alone. Humanities disciplines represent distinct ways of being interested in and making sense of human experience. They are distinct ways of recording and interpreting human experience, including the experience of health and illness, of seeking and undergoing, and for that matter, providing medical care. So there the emphasis, and it's similar to the idea that was coming out of my last slide, is this notion of the human experience, particularly the idea of the individual experience of health in the moment of the discussion or the encounter, let's use that word, it's probably a better word, the encounter either with ill health or pain, or what Evans and Finlay call here physical incapacities, and then following that, the subsequent encounter with the clinicians. And so the argument here is that in order to understand that moment, in order to understand how health is working at that moment, the diagnostic, the biological science, the idea of therapy or treatment is not enough. It requires the skills of the humanities in looking at what constitutes human experience to be able to give us more information about how we might treat, understand, respond to pain, illness, incapacity. So that was a large idea driving the development of the subject back in the beginning of the 21st century, how the humanities, what they might bring to the practice of medicine and health. In that collection of essays, Jane McNaughton, who is one of the major figures of medical humanities in the UK, she runs the Institute for Medical Humanities at Durham University, which I think is one of the very strongest in the country. And she wrote an essay, called Why Medical Humanities Now in that book. And I think she put forward a really interesting argument that over the 20 years since has been developed. She breaks down the ideas that Evans and Finlay discussed in their introduction to that book. And she splits what they're saying, if you like, into two major strands. And she says, there are two main ways in which humanities subjects might be relevant to medicine. One, often discussed, is that humanities play a primarily instrumental role in the education of future doctors. Works of literature, in particular, may help to introduce students to problematic life situations with which they may be unfamiliar. Art, literature, drama, and music in all their many forms are expressions of human creativity. They reflect human joy and sorrow, and human celebration and reflection. The humanities, therefore, have a second non-instrumental role in the education of doctors. They do not merely have a usefulness in contributing to ends other than themselves, they also have an intrinsic value in their own right. What's interesting there, I think, is this move that I've called in my title for this slide, beyond utility. So the idea that the reasons why doctors might read literature, might view art or listen to music, this idea that the reason to do that is to make them better physicians, better clinicians, is only one way to use the humanities. The other way is to understand what we might think of as their aesthetics, to understand them on their own terms, what McNaughton calls an intrinsic value in their own right. That the reason to look at the humanities is beyond this sense of utility. However, you might notice that even though McNaughton is dividing the humanities into two ways of working with medicine here, she's still discussing them in terms of the education of doctors. Whether being instrumental or non-instrumental, what she's saying here still is about medical education. And what I want to suggest is, however sophisticated these ideas of 20 years ago became, the subject has in fact moved a long way beyond the notion that medical humanities is only to be understood in terms of medical education. So my next slide. Back to Whitehead and Woods, writing in 2016, I think, where they put forward what we might understand as a critical turn, the critical turn in medical humanities that wanted to open the subject up, to move away from this idea of a pure instrumentalism or of training medical doctors of using the humanities in relation to medical education. So they say, we need to open up possibilities for the medical humanities to operate in radically different areas of critical consideration, to address difficult, more theoretically charged questions, and to claim a role much less benign than that of the supportive friend. How might the bodies of doctors and patients be marked in terms of race, class, gender, ability, and disability, and with what effects? What else, we might ask, is in the room, and with what forms or modes of agency might it be associated? How might we account for non-human objects and presences, for belief systems, and even for the diagnosis itself? What, for example, is its history or its status as a performative act? Where and when else might the scene be situated, and what difference would this make? I think those are fabulous questions. I think the sophistication they bring to the ideas of the primal scene of the critical encounter are so important. And I love this phrase that Whitehead and Woods have about being less benign than a supportive friend. In other words, we need to understand how that moment is much more complicated and complex than the clinical encounter, and that the humanities have a lot more to offer physicians than simply being a mode to unpack more ideas about the human experience. This notion that the humanities might help read theoretically, for example, the history of psychiatry to understand how psychiatric diagnosis may be at work in the room, how it might read systems of authority, of medical authority, to help us understand how that might be at work, how we need to understand race and gender, how these change what Whitehead and Woods here call the performative act. What happens if we change the scene, maybe from not a room in a clinic or a hospital, but to one in the community? Does that change how the experience of health is understood? I think these are the radically different arenas of which they write, and these are the more theoretically charged questions. And I think this set of questions, this idea of a theoretical sophistication, marks this really important critical term, where I would say the real value of a critical humanities starts to ask complex questions of how health experience is understood. Okay, my next slide. So these are the traditional subjects of medical humanities. I think even before the term was coined, these were subjects that have a long history and quite well known. One is the history of medicine. There is a strong discipline in history of medicine, including all aspects of history as we might think of it, the histories of institutions, the history of diseases, the history of the development of medical equipment, the colonial histories of medicine and how they spread throughout empires, etc. The second one, medical ethics, equally has a long and strong history in various kinds of discussions. And I've just given a list of some of them there, the philosophies of care, and of course, the key questions of biomedical research intervention, something that we might see a lot, for example, in certain kinds of health provision at the moment, especially around genetic modification. What are the boundaries? What should the boundaries be of genetic intervention in medicine at the moment? And the third one that has quite a long history is narrative medicine, and the idea of the patient's story and phenomenology as it is situated in relation to individual experience. And it's this third one I want to talk about the most, largely because I think as a student of English, as a scholar of narrative, it's the one I can speak to with a lot of familiarity. And it might be one that you yourselves recognize as something that's useful or something that you know about. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on this idea of narrative medicine, because I think of actually in relation to them, certainly from an English studies point of view. And I know there's quite I asked Manali before I gave this talk what the audience would be, and she said there was quite a strong makeup of arts backgrounds in the audience, that this idea of narrative might be one of interest. One of the best places to think about how narrative works is in the process of diagnosis. So I just want to spend a little bit of time looking at that here. This is a quotation from a book by Lisa Sanders, who is herself a practicing clinician in the United States. And it's her account of how diagnosis works in that clinical encounter moment. She says, the great majority of medical diagnoses, anywhere from 70 to 90%, are made on the basis of patients' stories alone. Although this is well established, far too often neither the doctor nor the patient seems to appreciate the importance of what the patient has to say in the making of a diagnosis. And yet, this is crucial information. None of our high-tech tests has such a high batting average. Neither does the physical exam, nor is there any other way to obtain this information. Talking to the patient more often than not provides essential clues to make the diagnosis. So what's interesting there, I think, is Sanders setting forward the importance of this kind of diagnosis and setting it against physical exams, testing, and the various other kinds of technological intervention that might make diagnosis possible. Getting the patient's story, listening to it, she says, is by far the most effective way of them being able to provide diagnosis. And I think to take this idea and to take this figure between 70 and 90%, and then just a step, if you like, a slide backwards, to think of the critical turn and the way in which Whiteheads and Woods say that moment needs to be complicated becomes really provocative. If we need to look at the patient's story to understand health experience, then we also need to be thinking of those complexities of situation, performance, race, gender, religion in the discussion that forms this diagnostic moment. So my next slide. As I said, the critical history of narrative medicine is long and a strong tradition. You can just see how the various ideas of illness narrative have developed over, and I've just given here 5 of the studies, but these are the major 5, I think, that have sought to explore both how the patient's story and how the idea of narrative itself speaks to them. In particular, the one I want to talk about briefly now is Arthur Frank's book, The Wounded Storyteller. I think it's interesting to see how both Kleinman and Frank, in their text, the top 2 bullet points, if you like, focus on ideas of suffering and healing and wounding. So this notion that part of the power of narrative and part of the power of story is to be able to speak to an idea of suffering and healing and wounding. I think, and maybe this will become clear when I talk over the next 5 minutes or so, that this is a rather loaded, a rather in many ways problematic way to understand where health may come from. But it certainly shaped the desire to, as Rita Sharon puts it in the subtitle for her book, the 3rd one down, the way to honor the stories of illness. So let's have a look at Frank. Writing in the 80s, but this is the 2nd edition of the book that was released 7 years ago. He says, telling stories of illness is the attempt, instigated by the body's disease, to give a voice to an experience that medicine cannot describe. This voice is embodied in a specific person, but it is equally social, taking its speech from the postmodern times we live in. The voice of the ill person is made possible by modernist medicine, but it cannot be contained by modernist assumptions, particularly those about medical professional dominance and the narrative surrender this dominance requires. A divide has been crossed into new territory, the postmodern, and we know this crossing by the new voices that are heard. So the body tells a story. The body's disease tells the story that medicine cannot describe. It may be located, Frank says, in an individual, but the way the story is told is more complex than what he calls the modernist medicine, the modernist technology, the modernist care, if you like, that makes assumptions about who the patient is and how medicine is practiced. So for me, I'm really interested in what Frank has to say here about professional dominance and narrative surrender. In other words, the idea that the clinician, the physician, whoever is practicing the professional aspect of, say, the diagnostic moment, is at that moment in a position of dominance. And in order to interact with the professional at that moment, the patient has to be in a position of surrender. And what he says is this doesn't work anymore. It's more complex than that, because the voices that address this modernist moment are postmodern, he says. I do think it's important, by the way, that he's using the word postmodern when writing in the 1980s. It might not be a word, term, a critical mode we would use at the moment. But when he talks about the divide into new territory, I think it's a well-expressed recognition of the excess, if you like, that comes in these new voices that have more to say about health experience than traditional modernist practices of medicine may be expressing. And I should put a little caveat here as well, I suppose. I'm talking about medicine, and in many cases, the quotations I've been looking are talking about medicine as if it is only one thing. I think both myself and everybody who's writing about medicine understand that that's not the case. Primary, secondary healthcare, for example, the huge differences between them, the very differences between health sciences, psychiatry, surgery, all of those kinds of things. I think we do understand we are not talking about one set of practices when we use a phrase like, medical professional. I think it's important to understand that, but there is an attempt by the humanities to talk about the ways in which these do have certain things in common. And one of them, I think, is an idea of authority and how that authority might be questioned. Okay, my next slide. So what Frank said when thinking about this idea of narrative and how it interacts with the health experience and with modernist medicine, he says there are three kinds of narratives. One is the restitution narrative, in which illness is rendered transitory. So you are not well, you are experiencing ill health, you interact with medicine and health professionals, and you get better. So your illness is transitory, you are restored to a mode of feeling well. The second one is what he calls the chaos narrative, the undertow of illness and the disasters that attend it. This one is interesting. Okay. He's talking there about disability, other conditions that are chaotic, in his words, that cannot be restored, that in many cases are congenital or are chronic and will last a lifetime. I think it's interesting in a way that he says these narratives have to be chaos. I think in the 30 years or so since he's written, closer to 35, I suppose, there's a strong idea that some of these disability conditions, for example, learning disabilities or autism or something like that, are not as chaotic as he seems to suggest, that they are not as disastrous as he seems to say in this quotation, that they have a language and a story of their own. And the third one is the quest narrative, as he puts it there, defined by the ill person's belief that something is to be gained through the experience. And I think Frank's own experience of having cancer is a good example of this. And indeed, many people do write about cancer in these terms, that you know something through being ill and you gain something from the experience. So these are his three narratives, and they're quite foundational in the narrative medicine study, and they're quite foundational to many forms of medical humanities. Though again, I would say that in many cases, I'm putting this information to you as an example of a kind of historical attitude that medical humanities has now surpassed. At the same time, narrative as therapy became something that emerged very much out of what Frank was saying. Rita Sharon, herself a medical practitioner who works at Columbia University in New York, put it like this: by equipping ourselves with narrative competence, we are able to use the self as a therapeutic instrument. Not only our cognitive grasp of human biology, but our imagination, our respect for the courage of others, our awareness of our own fragility, and our willingness to forgive and be forgiven. Through narrative effort, we achieve first the subject position, and then, with luck, the intersubject bond between ourselves and others, thereby inaugurating and framing the therapeutic relationship. So in the 90s and the beginning of the 20th century, to cut back, if you like, to some of those points that Evans and Finlay and McNaughton made, there was this strong idea that the humanities were to be used as therapeutic instruments. And that came out of a tradition of narrative medicine, as I hope I've been showing. I think now we would want to make a strong argument that the humanities, because of the kind of complexity of which Whitehead and Wood spoke, are more than simply vehicles for therapy, more than simply vehicles for therapeutic relationships, and that narrative is more complex than the way in which this appears to be practiced here. Well, what do I mean by that? If there is a greater complexity to this tradition of narrative medicine, how is it manifest? How might we use critical terms to describe it? And here I think there was a very important article published in 2015, which introduced these two terms, entanglement and risk, as part of that critical turn I'm describing that has happened in the last 10 years. And I find myself personally returning to this article a lot, which is in the British Medical Journal, Medical Humanities journal, which I hope you can get hold of. It was a special on this idea of the critical medical humanities. I find myself going back to it a lot, just to refresh my thinking about the subject and the discipline in light of these words, entanglement and risk. So Will Viney, Felicity Callard, and again Angela Wood say, we call for more intensive engagement in the medical humanities with how health, illness, and treatment are constituted in and through tangled webs of human and non-human biosocial organisms, political economic formations, discourses, and affects. Can the medical humanities intervene more explicitly in ontological questions, in particular of etiology, pathogenesis, intervention, and cure, rather than, as has commonly been the case, leaving such questions largely to the domains of the life sciences and biomedicine? It's a repeat of the point they made, Whitehead and Wood made, about being more than a supportive friend. And it's very much a critique of, and certainly development of, the idea that the humanities are a therapeutic tool. I take away from here the idea that's in italics of tangled webs, that it's better to understand the way in which health and individuals work, to think of them as tangled webs instead of a back and forth, if you like, relationship between a patient and a clinician. Instead, and I love the way they say this, they're like, how can our subjects in humanities intervene more explicitly in ontological questions? How can they deal more fundamentally in questions that traditionally have been left to the life sciences and biomedicine alone? And that's where I think a lot of the energy in critical medical humanities comes from at the moment. And it has, I think, proved a really interesting, in some cases, challenge to life sciences and biomedicine, so that they cannot only use literature or music or art as a way of thinking through how medicine might work, but have to understand that there are very foundational questions about the body, about ontology, about intervention, pathogenesis, all the various things that I mentioned here. And I think that's a very productive way of understanding the latest version of the relationship. To continue with what they say, it is necessarily an interdisciplinary subject. It has to practice an interdisciplinarity. I think medical humanities scholars at the moment in the UK, which is obviously the place I know best, are very much invested in, for example, if you want to talk about psychiatry, in working with psychiatrists. If you want to talk about medical technology, in working with those people who practice that. Not in making simple assumptions that you know what they are thinking, not only in describing them, for example, as medical scientists, but finding out the details of the work they do. And Viney, Callard, and Woods put it in this way. We believe that the critical medical humanities will flourish wherever the procedural norms and routines of the humanities, the social sciences and the biological sciences, are openly, evenly, and creatively interrogated and reworked. This means admitting biases and challenging authorizing discourses that have limited our understanding of what health and illness might be. So yes, the way in which biological sciences, social sciences, humanities work, informing one another to understand the biases of each, to understand the discourses that often run these subjects, to understand their limitations, and to work towards an interdisciplinarity that might better our understanding of what health and illness might be. This involves what Des Fitzgerald and Felicity Callard call a kind of living between disciplines, occupying a critical space that can talk between this sense of disciplines. We are committed to arguing, Fitzgerald and Callard say, in current or future work. So they're committed to arguing for the scholarship to come, if you like, the return to entanglement as epistemology, ontology, and phenomenological affective disposition might herald a more interesting future for scholars learning to live between disciplines. We want to suggest that such a stance might allow for a more critical entanglement with the sets of material, bodily, affective, linguistic, and disciplinary configurations within which both the medical humanities and those phenomena that they draw within their purview are endlessly bound. And I think then a number of things I take away from this quotation. We're back to this idea of entanglement. We're back to this idea of being bound, of a tangled web, if you like, as one of the previous quotations put it. And in order to practice that, you need to be between the disciplines, as Fitzgerald and Callard say. It's interesting here as well, we might talk about this more in the questions, I suppose, that a lot of the way that medical humanities scholarship now wants to address this interdisciplinarity does evolve around materiality, does involve questions of the body and of affect. This is one of the strong things I think that has come out of the way the new critical medical humanities practices itself. In part, I think it draws on traditions from history and English studies, but also very strongly from phenomenology and that branch of philosophy that wants to investigate the practice of the body in the world. Okay, so I've stressed, if you like, through the quotations of others, this notion of collaboration, of being entangled, of being bound together, of being in a web. And there's just something here that might say, okay, well, how does this work? Let's have some concrete examples maybe that can help me express to you the way in which I think such a methodology can be more than just a theory, can be more of a method of working to produce scholarship which exists in the humanities, but also biomedicine. So my 3 bullet points there. How does this methodology work? What are its qualities and practices? And then I'm going to give 2 examples of current research projects that I think exemplify what I've been trying to argue, and I hope so do so in some detail. Well, when we talk about assemblages and networks that come from critical humanities perspective, using the latest tools from critical humanities formations, what might that look like? Well, one of them, if you remember back to the early slides that I showed, was this idea that the practice of medicine is fundamentally humanist, that there's a humanist concern when a clinician meets a patient because what's being described is a human, is a human's illness, is an individual's sense of her, his body, their health experience, to which another human, the doctor, responds. Well, posthumanism, which is a subject I'm very interested in, has a critique of this idea of the bounded and centered body. It would want to place that body in that clinical encounter, in that primal scene of where the doctor meets the patient. It would want to place that body within a web that includes gender, race, discourses of authority, discourses of power, even, interestingly, I think, the non-human, the material objects in the room. How might they, anything from pictures on the wall to the technology and equipment being used, how might they inflect that moment of the clinical encounter? I think the post-humanist critique of the human is one of the most powerful operating practices in contemporary medical humanities. With that, I think, with that critique of the human comes the critique of biological essentialism, the idea that we understand biology through the notion of the individual, or the notion of the human body helps us to understand human biology. There's an advanced, I think, philosophical, theoretical critique, again, much of which comes out of phenomenology, of that sense that the human is to be understood as biologically essential in a bounded and centered form. One example of that is rereading the temporality of life, the very idea of death of the body. At what point does the body die, for example, has been a subject for critical medical humanities study with regards to the ending of cell life, organ failure, brain, heart. I'm sure a number of the issues that you know about. Similarly, rethinking the idea of humanism and essentialism also, in that third bullet point, makes us rethink the modernist boundaries of selfhood, makes us understand different ideas of what constitutes transformation, which I think, for example, does a great job of reconstituting what we might think of as Arthur Frank's idea of restitution. And all of these, as I said down the bottom, are pursued through a reading of the biological body itself as material, as something that's implicated in webs, in networks and assemblages. If you know those last two words, in particular networks and assemblage, you might know that they come from a lot of the work of Deleuze and Guattari in a philosophical zone. So the two examples quite quickly, and I'll close in a couple of minutes. The Shame and Medicine project is a new project that has been operating for a couple of years, but just has received considerable funding to operate for another 5 years. It's run by Barry Lyons, who is at the University of Birmingham, Luna Dolezal, who works at the University of Exeter. And I just wanted to put this project and the way it's described in a special issue of the Medical Humanities Journal that they wrote. I just wanted to put it up as an example of how this interdisciplinarity happens. So they say, the Shame and Medicine project evolved from a conversation between the two editors of the special issue of Medical Humanities about the politics of shame and humiliation within healthcare. One is a philosopher with an academic focus in the phenomenology of the body, that's Luna Dolezal. The other a clinician with an interest in medical training and regulation. Over the 2 years the project has run thus far, we have had the pleasure of hearing from scholars and practitioners from over 20 distinct and diverse disciplines, from theology and history to plastic surgery and contemporary visual culture. It has been a truly interdisciplinary engagement, and one that has reflected shame's role as a commonplace social emotion, frequently underground or hidden, but which has effective and continues to impact on many health-related interactions between individuals and society, patients and doctors, clinicians and regulators. One of the things I like very much about the Shame and Medicine program is, firstly, its topic, the very idea of shame. Shame is something, of course, that evades technical testing, the instrumentalization, if you will, of modernist medicine. How might one measure shame? How might one understand it? And one of the things I like about the project, it is immediately up front in noting that shame is a major issue in the practice and experience of health. And yet it is very difficult to fully describe. And the way in which, the second thing maybe I should say, that I really like about the project, as you can see from that quotation, it's highly interdisciplinary. Look at the way in which scholars are meeting theology, history, plastic surgery, visual culture, the way in which scholars come together to discuss it. And the last one, and this is slightly self-promoting, but forgive me, the last one is the project of which I'm the principal investigator, which Manali mentioned at the start of my talk. Imagining technologies for disability futures, something I think we in the project feel is very important. How will the disabled body, the disabled experience, interact with the development of future biomedical technologies, for example, robotics, which is something we're really interested in. So that is split across 4 universities in the UK. You'll see the second bullet point there, along with international partners in the US and in Japan. And we have all sorts of non-academic partners as well, as I listed there, from arts festivals to filmmakers to children hospital participants and disability groups. And I think this is a key point. It's a difficult one on which to end because it says something about our research culture. But very often it's recognized that the only way in which you can really practice these innovative collaborations and interdisciplinary research is through major funding. And so in this case, we were very lucky to get £1.5 million from the Wellcome Trust in order for us to be able to pursue this work. So I hope that with Imagining Technologies for Disability Futures and Shame and Medicine, I've given 2 examples of the way in which I think interdisciplinarity and collaboration is currently being practiced in the medical humanities, and the way in which that comes out of a set of ideas about entanglement, about assemblages that themselves build on the older models of scholarship, of ethics, of narrative medicine that go back to that idea of the clinical encounter. I hope I've put that all in some kind of story and that it's been useful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot for this insightful presentation, for helping us understand how the discipline has grown and has evolved and has become more and more complex in this current culture of biomedicine and genetic engineering. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So, sir, we have a couple of questions that I'll be reading out to you now. And I request all the other participants, if you have any question to ask, you can kindly post it on the chat box. I'll take those questions and I'll convey the same to Professor Murray. Sir, the first question is asked by Mr. Anthony. He wants to know how the medical humanities as a discipline can be related to the pandemic literature. And if a few other questions are there that are quite connected to this point, where participants would like to know a few pandemic literary texts that we can use in order to understand the role of medical humanities, to know this current situation in which we are all in. And another is that how medical humanities is becoming more relevant and popular in this current pandemic scenario. Am I able to communicate, sir?
Yes. So as I understand it, there are a different set of questions with different emphases around the issue of now and the pandemic. And let me try and answer them from what I hope is a variety of perspectives. One, I think, would be a history perspective of placing pandemics within the historical context. So, for example, there's been quite a bit of discussion of Spanish flu, of cholera in the 19th century, going back to plague. So one of the ways in which we can think about our current pandemic is by looking at previous pandemics, how they shaped society, how they shaped politics, how they shaped the organizations of culture. And of course, there are historians who've been working on that kind of material for their whole careers. A second one would be understanding specifically the history of medicine. So we are thinking about the pandemic at the moment very much in epidemiological terms. Okay, well, epidemiology has a history. It has not always been the way in which we understand how pandemics function. It has been, if you like, something that, as we know, when we look at the figures that come out from all the countries of the world at the moment, very much relies on data. Well, medical humanities can ask the question, what does this reliance on data mean? The rise of epidemiology is, relatively speaking, quite new. It's what, about 60, 70 years? Before that, the practice of understanding major global health did not rely on the kind of data in thinking through a pandemic as epidemiological. It relied more on the idea of medical breakthroughs, of discoveries of new cures, new vaccines, and that kind of thing. So one of the things that the medical humanities can do there is help us better interrogate what we mean by the data and the statistics we're producing. A third one might be something I'm very interested in, which is to do with fiction. I'm currently writing an article about speculative literature and pandemic writing. In other words, there are a whole series of novels published over the last 10 years or so, which write of, in the near future, communities affected by different types of flu, by different types of pandemic. And they were all written before the current pandemic, but they're eerily prescient of the ways in which pandemics might work. And so I find it really interesting, these novels, in the context of a world they predicted imaginatively, but in fact preempted, if you think about it in terms of time. So hopefully there I've given some examples of both history and fiction, and of course there are others. Films would be another one, films that anticipate a world of the pandemic. How do we read those texts? How do we read those structures to help us understand what we might be thinking of? How do we read that understanding of entanglement, of the way in which, to understand the pandemic, we need to respond in terms of not just medicine, but the social sciences and understanding of political sciences. Another one that I should mention, I think, is an understanding of colonial medicine and the way in which colonial medicine has practiced public health, which is not the same in India as it was in Australia or South Africa or South America, for example. There's no doubt that a colonial history of public health intervention means the pandemic is being experienced in different ways by different cultures. So that's a range of examples, I hope.
Thank you, sir. There is another question by Dr. Suman Prasad. He asks, how does post-humanism affect our perception of literature and the impact of AI on the understanding of agency?
I think that's a fabulous question. Thanks very much indeed. One of the words we might use there is through an idea of distribution. I think the very notion of AI as a set of functions, if you like, which is about the distribution of agency. So if I can be a little bit more precise, when you work in the development of biotechnological robotics, which can help, for example, with surgery, how does that relate to what we understand to be the conventional or traditional notion of the surgeon, of the skilled figure who practices a certain kind of expertise? AI, robotics, the post-humanism that comes with them, I think, very much decenter that idea of the medical practitioner as the centered, authoritative agent. That no longer exists when you have an AI maybe in a healthcare system that collects data, that organizes data in certain other kinds of ways. Another way to think about it might be the way in which algorithms are used to provide pharmaceutical interventions to read health conditions across large communities. There you've got a variety of health experiences being read as data by an AI system in ways that humans simply couldn't. Now, of course, we all know the limitations of this, but I think one of the interesting ways in which post-humanism, in its desire to make the notion of the body more complex, post-humanism is really useful there, from getting us away from the idea that is only through, say, the individual, the intervention of the individual is the only way in which medicine and health can make sense, that it is simply individual acts that make the difference. I mean, one of the things I'll just say, a slight anecdote, here in the UK, much of the blame for how our experience of the pandemic became so chronic was placed upon individual actions. It was your fault if you went into a public space where you might catch the virus. It was your fault if you were irresponsible in some way. And I think this has done a rather dangerous job of deflecting away from the networks and the assemblages and the complexities of actually how a virus functions. And it's very insidious to think that an individual or individual actions somehow put us all at risk. The things that are putting us at risk are better understood, I think, as networks of affects, as the material that is spread across AIs and a wider sense of an assemblage. But it's a very good question, I think, because the way in which, if I can put it, agency is dethroned by posthumanism gives us fantastically productive ways to think about medicine and health in the current time.
Thank you, sir.
I have one question.
To kindly mute your audio. Please mute your audio.
May I ask one?
Yes, please. Sir, Rudrani, hello. Yes.
Hello?
Yes, my question is to you that how does mercy death differ from mercy killing? Is one more morally acceptable than another?
I'm not trying to dodge your question, but I would have to say that I'm no philosopher. I do find that a very difficult question to answer because of a lack of knowledge, I think, of what I would understand as morals, and because I'm no kind of practicing clinician, I've never been in a situation where the idea of mercy is ever at work. I could say things on it, but I'd be worried that they would be ill-informed. And so I think, with respect, I'm going to have to say I simply do not have the knowledge to properly answer that question, which is a very vexed question and difficult question. And therefore, I would not want to say something on it that is too inappropriate. With apologies.
I hope sir has responded to your question, ma'am.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. I know this is really a very tough question, and generally people avoid to answer this. And thank you for that. That exactly you accept to comment on that question even. Thank you so much.
You have raised your hand, sir. Could you please ask your question?
Manali?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask a question myself, ma'am?
Yes, please, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes,
sir, this is a question to you. Sir, your lecture is very wonderful, really. This is very highly relevant to the present situation also. But the thing is, when we do phenomenological study, how far it's reliable, the responses are reliable. It's because they lived in experience. From the lived in experience, how can we say that this is something reliable? Because realities are multiple.
Sorry, go on.
Yes, sir.
No, sorry, I said please finish your sentence. You were about to go on.
Oh, no, for the phenomenological study I'm talking about, when we receive responses from different patients, how far it's reliable, how far we can rely on their responses. That's what I like to know from you, sir.
Yes, I mean, it depends upon sample size to some degree, doesn't it? If you are getting through a research project, for example, the one that I'm currently involved with, which includes phenomenology and working with people with disabilities, we are only, I think it's a fair point to make, we only have access to maybe a limited number of, in our case, people with disabilities. But that doesn't mean that the way in which their description of their own sense of physical being in the world, the materiality of their bodies, if you like, the way in which they experience illness, it doesn't mean that simply because there are, it is not a large cohort study, it doesn't mean, I think, the ideas that are contained within them are in some way inappropriate. I mean, maybe I could flesh that out with a bit more of a detailed example. People with disabilities are often the most researched people within medicine. There's always ongoing research on them in some way or another. For example, in the development of prostheses, there are technical questions to be asked if you're working in developing biotechnologies about how prosthetics work, how they might fit, all of those kinds of things. Far less common is any question about the idea of the body that the person who is receiving the prosthetic might have. What is their sense of self? Do they think, for example, that when they have a prosthetic limb, do they think it is replacing one that has been lost? Do they think it is a new object with which they have to contend? Do they think it makes them whole? Do they think it's something that in the end they could do without? I'm always interested in people who do have prosthetic limbs who over time come to feel that they're not necessary. That seems to go against our sense of what technology can bring. So although there may not be a huge cohort study, I think there is a lot of research evidence, if I can put it like that, which is very reliable because it draws on traditions of thinking about the body and listening to patient experience, which shows how that materiality, that sense of a body being in the world, if I can generalize about phenomenology in that moment, can give us new information about how health is delivered and is experienced. And I certainly know from my conversations with roboticists in my university that they often have been far less concerned with how the patient feels about receiving a prosthetic limb, with the technical issues that go into the development and production of that prosthetic limb. So I think when you use the word reliable, which is a really interesting word, I think there can be attention given to the reliability with which people describe their own body experiences, and that that's something that can be factored into the relationship between, say, a philosopher, a humanities, say a historian of prosthetics, and those who are delivering the biotechnologies that make life with prosthetics in lots of ways possible.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for responding to the queries. I think we have many more. So would you like to take one or two more questions, sir?
Yes, I'm happy to go on for some more time.
Okay, sir. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you. So Rudrani Dashgupta, she wants to know a little more about this understanding of performative act in relationship to diagnosis. How diagnosis can also be perceived through the lenses of performativity.
It's a good question. The things that come into my mind are a couple of things, and maybe that I'll mention them now. Imagine for a second the necessity to do diagnosis on someone where there is no clinical marker of disease or health condition. So for example, where certain psychiatric conditions or disability conditions are presenting in a way that requires diagnosis. Often what has to take place in that moment is a reading of the individual by the expertise of the doctor, because there is no blood test, for example, for autism. So if you're going to diagnose someone with autism, you necessarily have to do so through a set of questions, an understanding, if you like, of behavior, interaction with the family, which is a kind of web of expertise. It's a web of authority in understanding the person who's presented to you. And you give that diagnosis, if you like, based on the way in which you read the individual in front of you and you assess their needs. And so I think understanding that diagnosis itself is a narrative. And it's a narrative that, to some degree, and this is why I'm interested in these words as an English studies scholar, it's a narrative that characterizes the person that you see in front of you. It characterizes them as having something. So, for example, bipolar or schizophrenia. And it characterizes how you think they might be treated, aggressively or not. Do they need institutionalizing in any way? Is that an intervention that has to be made? I think the idea that diagnosis names a condition very clearly and obviously is something that medical humanities and narrative studies shows cannot be the case. It is far more ambivalent than that. It is far less concrete. At the same time, that is not to say that the diagnosis doesn't need to be made, because of course, in many cases it does, because diagnosis will open up resources, will hopefully open up support for the person and their family. So you have the very real concrete moment of the need to provide healthcare. But you also have, and I think this is very productive, if you admit to the kind of entanglement that's at work at that moment, about, for example, what benefit the patient and the family will get through having access to healthcare, which is not the same thing as reading the behavior of the person who might get the diagnosis, which is not the same thing as, for example, the model of psychiatry, to use that example, that's being practiced, that's being performed in that moment. So the performative act, I think, is kind of multiple. The person is performing their expertise, they're performing their medical knowledge, and to some degree, when you assess someone on behavior, you're reading their performance as well. You're reading how they express themselves through their bodily difference or their cognitive difference. And I found it really useful in the work, for example, I've done on autism, in reading that diagnostic moment as a series of performances, whether by the individual or the state or the subject as it's being defined at that time. And then I think you gain a very rich picture of how diagnosis works, and not simply that it is the name given to a condition at a specific moment in time. It contains histories, it contains complexities. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot for your insights. One last question to you, sir. The participant wants to know how the development in the patient's rights have problematized the rights of the physician in the healthcare profession.
That's a really good question. Yes, I think to some degree it goes back to the points I was making before about authority, doesn't it? What came with medical authority, the idea of expertise through which a clinician can practice, whether that be just, for example, the kind of aggressive surgery that was used in treating cancer in the first half of the 20th century, where the surgeon was almost like a kind of hero figure who could be tested. And so this is before, obviously, chemotherapy and new ways of treating cancer came along. But those methods of intervention in health lives, which were often dominated by the medical authority of the clinician, are things that have been revised, when we think more about patients' rights. I suppose another good example, one that I think actually is more pertinent to the questioner's question, would be institutionalization of people with mental health problems and people with cognitive disabilities and learning disabilities, as it was practiced by many for much of the 20th century. and the way in which patients' rights and a recognition of the validity of different kinds of cognitive states have changed. Certainly throughout much of Europe, that would be the situation I know, where institutionalization is now nowhere near as common. And the idea is that people with mental health issues and learning disorders live in the community, and that they and their families have more rights. So the question was, how does this pose problems? Well, on one level, the idea that the medical intervention may have to be slower, may have to be more considerate, may have to take into account the life as lived or as going to be lived by the patient, that might be seen to be problematic for the clinician because it slows things down. It means they can't act immediately as they might want to. But I think thinking it through, although that makes it more complex, and it means the clinician needs to know more about the law, about the possibilities for health care, about social webs of health, about families. I think the fact the clinician needs to know more about that is hugely productive. For me, what it does, and I say this as the parent of a disabled child, for me, it restores an idea of integrity to the patient, because it gives them rights they did not have before. It gives them the right, for example, not to be institutionalized. So it pushes back, I think, against a number of highly problematic areas of medical authority. And if it makes the clinician's work more complex, then I think it does so in very productive ways. And I think to give patients rights about their treatment and about their version of the, let's go back to that primal scene of the encounter, to give them rights is to recognize the validity of their lives, recognize their right to be participants in society and culture, and not merely people who are taken away from sight or who are pushed to the edges of those societies and culture. So I think it's highly valuable, although I'm sure in your country, as in mine, it's still the case that the practice of these legal rights is often very difficult, and that there's an ongoing struggle for patients who want to express their rights, because frequently those rights are not always recognized. So it's an ongoing issue, I think.
Thanks a lot, sir. A lot for responding to our queries. I believe we have more, but we are running out of time. I thank all the participants for joining us, for being with us. And I especially thank Professor Murray, because this is a wonderful experience for research scholars, for faculty members, and for upcoming academicians like us who would like to develop on our research ideas to help contribute in the area of medical humanities, sir. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you for giving us your valuable time, sir.
Can I just say thank you to everybody for participating. Thank you very much for the questions and queries you put to me. I'm very sorry that we haven't had time to answer them all. I just hope that in the talk, which I tried to make as broad as possible, there was material there which you will find provocative and useful. And I hope you can see links in your own research and your own practice to it. And I wish you all the best and luck for the work, your work, as you take it forward.
So I hope we are looking forward to more insightful talks like this from your side, sir. Hope that we'll have a chance to invite you to our own campus, sir.
I would love that. I would really enjoy that. I also hope that's possible.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time, and again for your organization, Manali. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot, sir. We are always indebted to you, sir, for your support, without which this event would have never been possible, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye, sir. Thank you. I request all the participants to kindly fill in the feedback form. Once you fill the form, the certificate will be generated for all of you. Any query, any confusion, then please write to me. I'm just typing my email ID on the chat box. And I thank all of you for joining us for this session. Thanks a lot. Rumi Verma, would you like to ask anything?
No, sir.
Hello.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Manali ma'am, I would say that it was really a nice effort. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. Thank you for your encouraging words, ma'am. Thank you.
No, definitely this is really a good session.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Hello, madam.
Yes.
Ma'am, where are we supposed to fill in the feedback form?
I have given the link on the chat box, ma'am. Haven't you got it? I'm just giving it, resending it once again.
Okay, yeah, please.
Could you please locate it right now?
Yeah, yes, I can see
Yeah.
it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Miss Manali.
Yeah, please tell me.
Yeah, I hope you are fine in this pandemic times.
Yeah, I'm doing good.
Okay. I want to suggest something, if you
Yeah.
allow.
Yeah,
So
please.
can we have a webinar over the medical ethics and laws in Indian community, or in contrast with other communities or fraternities in other foreign country?
Medical ethics and law. Have I heard you correctly?
Yes, medical ethics
Yeah.
and laws.
Thanks a lot, ma'am, for this suggestion. Actually, we are having a plan to organize a workshop. So,
Okay.
yeah. So, have you mentioned the theme on your feedback form, ma'am, so that I'll be able
Yes,
to
I'm
locate
filling
it?
it out. Yes, I'm
Yeah.
filling it out.
Kindly give us your suggestions so that in near future, whenever we are doing something on medical humanities, we can also incorporate the suggestions which you have given, ma'am.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. I have received my certificate. It was really a very quick working.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
And I will let you, I request you, whenever you just conduct such a program, you please just give me the link, or just WhatsApp me, please.
Ma'am, I already have all the contact information with me. So as I have already said that we are having a plan to have a workshop, might be in another 1-2 months. So at the time, definitely whoever the contacts which we have with us, We'll definitely inform those participants about the forthcoming event as well, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all your team. It was really a very good webinar and good working also.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot for your encouraging words. Thank you.
पानी आज फिर बरस गया।